What would you do if a stray dog you fed once returned the next day, during a brewing hurricane, carrying something he trusted you with more than his own life? Not food, not a toy. Something that would force you to make a choice between your own safety and a responsibility you never asked for. This isn't a story about a random act of kindness. It's about what happens when compassion becomes a covenant you can't break, even when the storm of the century is bearing down on you. And it started with a decision so small, Sandy Miller almost didn't make it at all. Before we go any further, welcome. We're so glad you're here for this incredible true story. Drop a comment right now and let us know what city you're watching from. And if you believe one small act of kindness can change everything, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness will restore your faith in the connection between humans and animals. The moment that would change everything began on an ordinary Tuesday morning, with nothing more dramatic than the sound of waves in the distance and the smell of coffee going cold on a weathered porch railing. Sandy Miller had chosen this life deliberately. The cabin sat 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, tucked into a stretch of North Carolina coastline where the pine forest met salt marsh and the Atlantic Ocean whispered constantly in the background. It wasn't luxury. The porch boards were warped from humidity. The paint was peeling. The screens had holes that let mosquitoes in on summer nights, but it was hers, and more importantly, it was quiet. She had moved here 2 years ago. After the divorce finalized and the last of her belongings fit into a U-Haul she drove herself. Her daughter was grown, living in Charlotte with a family of her own. Her ex-husband had the house, the friends, the life they'd built together. Sandy took the silence. Most mornings followed the same pattern. She woke before dawn, made coffee in the old percolator that had belonged to her mother, and carried it out to the porch while the world was still gray and undefined. She would sit in the wooden rocker, the only furniture she'd insisted on keeping, and listen. Wind through the pines, gulls calling from the marsh, the distant, rhythmic crash of waves that never quite stopped, even on the calmest days. It was during these mornings that Sandy felt most herself, not the woman she'd been for 23 years of marriage. Not the mother who'd worried herself sick over every scraped knee and bad grade. Just Sandy, 46 years old, alone by choice, healing in increments so small she sometimes couldn't tell if she was making progress at all. This particular Tuesday in late August, the air felt different, heavier, the kind of thickness that came before storms when the atmosphere pressed down and made everything feel closer than it was. Sandy had lived through enough hurricane seasons to recognize the signs. The weather reports had been tracking a tropical depression in the Caribbean for days, something that might become something, or might dissolve into nothing. She'd learned not to panic early, but she'd also learned to prepare. After her coffee, she walked the property line, checking the shutters she'd installed last year, noting which branches hung too close to the roof, mentally cataloging what needed to be secured if the storm turned their way. That's when she saw him. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving at the tree line where the yard gave way to forest. But then the shadow moved again, and Sandy realized it was a dog. Not a large dog, medium-sized, maybe 30 pounds, with a coat that might have been golden or tan under all the dirt and matting. He stood completely still about 50 feet away, watching her with an intensity that made her stop walking. Sandy had seen plenty of strays over the years. This close to the marsh, people dumped animals they didn't want anymore, assuming they'd survive on their own or find new homes. Most didn't. The ones who did became half-wild, skittish, dangerous if cornered. But this dog didn't look wild. He looked watchful, careful, like he was assessing her the same way she was assessing him. She could see his ribs through his matted coat. His ears, floppy, probably a Cocker Spaniel mix, were tangled with burrs. But his eyes were clear and intelligent, tracking her every movement without aggression or fear. Just observation. Sandy didn't move closer, didn't call out or make any sudden gestures. She'd learned long ago that trust with animals, like trust with people, couldn't be rushed. After a long moment, she turned and walked back to the cabin, feeling his eyes on her the entire way. The next morning, he was there again. Same spot, same watchful stillness. This time, Sandy brought her coffee out and sat on the porch steps instead of the rocker, making herself smaller, less threatening. The dog didn't approach. Didn't retreat either. Just stood at the tree line, waiting for something Sandy couldn't identify. On the third morning, she left food. Not on the porch. That felt too presumptuous, too much like claiming him. But at the edge of the yard, where grass met forest, just a bowl of kibble she'd driven 20 minutes to buy, and a dish of water. She set them down, walked back to the porch, and waited. The dog didn't move until she'd been inside for 10 minutes. Through the kitchen window, Sandy watched him approach the bowls with cautious, deliberate steps. He ate quickly, efficiently, like someone who'd learned not to trust that food would still be there if he took his time. Then he was gone, disappearing into the forest so completely it was like he'd never been there at all. This became their routine. Every morning, Sandy would leave food and water at the same spot. Every morning, the dog would wait until she'd gone inside before eating, and every evening, just before sunset, he would reappear at the tree line, watching the cabin for a few minutes before melting back into the woods. She noticed things about him as the days passed. The way he always looked back over his shoulder toward the deeper forest, as if checking on something or someone. The way his ears would prick up at certain sounds, not just nearby noises but distant ones Sandy couldn't even hear. The way he never fully relaxed, even while eating, his body coiled and ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. He was protecting something, or looking for something. Sandy couldn't tell which. She named him Copper, after the color his coat probably was under all the dirt and matting. Not that she called him by name. That felt too much like attachment, and Sandy had promised herself she wouldn't get attached to anything that could leave. But, in her mind, he was Copper. By the second week of their routine, the weather reports had grown more urgent. The tropical depression had strengthened into Tropical Storm Helena, then into Hurricane Helena, and the projected path had shifted north. The cone of uncertainty included the North Carolina coast, included Sandy's stretch of isolated shoreline. Local officials weren't ordering evacuations yet, but they were recommending that residents in flood-prone areas consider leaving. Sandy's cabin sat on higher ground, built to withstand storm surge, but she started preparing anyway. She brought in the porch furniture, secured the shutters, filled containers with fresh water. Charged every battery-powered device she owned, and every morning she left food for Copper, even as the wind began to pick up and the sky took on that peculiar yellow-gray color that meant serious weather was coming. On the fourth day of storm preparation, 10 days after Copper first appeared, Sandy noticed something different. She'd left the food as usual, earlier than normal because the local news was reporting that Helena had strengthened to a Category 2 and was expected to make landfall within 48 hours. But when she looked out the window an hour later, the food was still there. Untouched. Sandy frowned, checking the tree line. No sign of Copper. She waited another hour, still nothing. By evening, the food had blown over in the strengthening wind, kibble scattering across the yard. Sandy retrieved the bowls and brought them inside, feeling an unease she couldn't quite name. That night, the wind howled around the cabin with enough force to rattle the shutters. Rain came in sheets, horizontal and angry. Sandy lay in bed, listening to the storm's early edges, and thought about a dog alone in the forest with no shelter and no food. She told herself it wasn't her problem, that Copper had survived this long without her help, that he probably had a den or a safe place she didn't know about. But sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, 24 hours before Helena's expected landfall, Sandy woke to an eerie calm. The eye wall was still offshore, but the feeder bands were moving through, bringing intermittent bursts of violent weather between periods of unsettling quiet. She made coffee out of habit more than desire, and carried it to the porch, even though every instinct told her to stay inside. The yard was littered with small branches and pine needles. The sky was the color of a bruise. And at the tree line, in the exact spot where Copper always appeared, there was nothing. No dog, no movement, just the wind picking up again, bending the trees and carrying the smell of ozone and ocean. Sandy stood there for a long time, coffee growing cold in her hands, wondering why the absence of a stray dog she'd known for less than 2 weeks felt like such a profound loss. She was about to go inside when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the rain or the distant ocean. A bark, single, sharp, urgent, coming from the forest. Sandy's heart kicked hard against her ribs. She set down her coffee and walked to the edge of the porch, straining to see through the dim morning light and the first drops of returning rain. Nothing. Then the bark came again, closer this time, and underneath it another sound, something high-pitched and desperate that made every instinct in Sandy's body go rigid with alarm. Because it wasn't just Copper out there in the forest, it was something, someone he'd been protecting all along. Sandy didn't think. She moved. The sound coming from the forest wasn't constant. It came in bursts between gusts of wind, high-pitched and frantic, layered underneath Copper's urgent barking. Every maternal instinct she'd spent 2 years trying to suppress roared back to life in an instant. She grabbed the rain jacket hanging by the door and stepped off the porch into the strengthening wind. Rain was starting again, fat drops that hit hard enough to sting. The forest looked darker than it should have, even with the storm clouds overhead. "Copper," she called out, her voice swallowed almost immediately by the wind. The barking stopped. For a terrible moment, there was only the sound of wind through pine trees and her own ragged breathing. Then she saw movement, a flash of matted golden fur emerging from the tree line. Copper appeared. But he wasn't alone. Sandy's breath caught in her throat. In his mouth, carried with the gentleness of something infinitely precious, was a puppy. Not a stick, not debris. A living, breathing puppy so small it fit entirely in Copper's jaws without him having to open wide. The puppy was making the sound she'd heard, weak, mewling cries that were barely audible over the storm. Copper walked straight toward her, his gait unsteady but determined. He didn't run, didn't hesitate at the boundary where yard met porch. He climbed the 3 wooden steps with effort, his legs shaking, and set the puppy down directly at Sandy's feet. Then he looked up at her. His eyes, those intelligent, watchful eyes she'd been observing for 2 weeks, held something that made Sandy's chest tighten. Not pleading exactly, something deeper. Trust. The kind of trust that came with a terrible weight attached. He had chosen her, not randomly, not out of convenience. Copper had fed from her hand for 2 weeks, had watched her, had assessed her character in whatever way dogs assess these things, and had decided she was worthy of this, of protecting what mattered most to him. Sandy knelt slowly, rain already soaking through her jacket. The puppy was tiny, maybe 3 weeks old, covered in mud and shivering violently. Its eyes weren't fully open yet. Its fur was plastered to its body, making it look even smaller than it was. "Oh, God," Sandy whispered. She looked at Copper, who hadn't moved. He stood at rigid attention, water streaming off his matted coat, his eyes fixed on the puppy. Watching. Waiting. "Where did you—" Sandy started, then stopped. The question was pointless. She could see where he'd been. His paws were caked with mud that was different from the sandy soil around her cabin. Darker, wetter, the kind that came from low-lying areas. His legs had fresh scratches, some still bleeding, and his body was trembling with exhaustion that went beyond just the cold. Sandy's mind raced through possibilities. A den that had flooded, a mother dog that had died or abandoned her litter, Copper finding this one, saving this one, and bringing it to the only human he'd learned to trust. The puppy made another weak sound, and Sandy made her decision. She scooped it up carefully, cradling it against her chest where it was warmest and driest. The puppy was cold, far too cold, its tiny body still shaking despite being out of the wind. "Come on," Sandy said to Copper, standing. "Both of you. Inside." For the first time since she'd known him, Copper didn't hesitate. He followed her into the cabin, his nails clicking on the wooden floor, leaving muddy prints in his wake. Sandy didn't care about the floor. She went straight to the linen closet and pulled out the softest towels she owned, spreading them in front of the fireplace. She'd built a fire that morning, more for comfort than warmth, but now she was grateful for it. She set the puppy down gently on the towels and began drying it with careful hands, working quickly but trying not to scrub too hard against its delicate skin. The puppy squirmed weakly, its tiny paws pushing against her fingers. Copper sat beside her, so close his wet fur pressed against her arm. He watched every movement she made with the puppy, his body coiled with tension, ready to intervene if she did something wrong. "I'm being careful," Sandy murmured to him. "I promise." She wasn't sure if dogs understood promises, but Copper's body relaxed fractionally. As she worked, Sandy assessed the damage. The puppy was definitely too young to be away from its mother. Its eyes were barely starting to open, just slits that showed a hint of blue underneath. It was emaciated, ribs visible even through the puppy fat. But it was breathing steadily, and when Sandy gently pressed on its belly, it squirmed in protest. That was a good sign. A dying puppy wouldn't have the energy to protest. "You need food," Sandy said more to herself than to either animal. "And warmth, and—" She stopped, realization hitting her. She had no puppy supplies, no formula, no bottles, no heating pad designed for animals. She had kibble appropriate for an adult dog and some canned food she'd bought for Copper, but nothing suitable for something this young. Her nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. The nearest store was 15 miles, and Hurricane Helena was scheduled to make landfall in less than 24 hours. The roads would already be dangerous. Soon they'd be impassable. Think about this for a moment. Have you ever had to make a split-second decision that changed everything? When helping someone meant risking your own safety? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're on the edge of your seat wondering what happens next, hit that like button and share this story with someone who believes in the power of compassion. Sandy looked at the puppy, now slightly warmer and dry, still making soft, distressed sounds. Then she looked at Copper, who hadn't taken his eyes off the tiny creature. "Okay," she said firmly. "Okay, we'll figure this out." She stood and went to the kitchen, Copper following immediately. In the refrigerator she found whole milk. Not ideal. She knew that much about puppies, but it would have to do until she could get proper formula. She warmed it slightly, tested it on her wrist the way she used to test bottles for her daughter decades ago, and found an eyedropper in the medicine cabinet. When she returned to the fireplace, the puppy had managed to crawl a few inches across the towels, seeking warmth. Sandy picked it up, settled into a sitting position with her back against the couch, and brought the eyedropper to its mouth. The puppy latched onto it immediately, sucking weakly but determinedly. Milk dribbled down its chin, but some of it was getting in. Sandy could see its throat working, swallowing. Copper lay down beside her, his head resting on her thigh, watching the feeding with the focused attention of someone witnessing a miracle. They stayed like that for 20 minutes, Sandy patiently feeding the puppy drop by drop, while the wind outside built to a roar and rain hammered the cabin's metal roof. When the puppy finally stopped sucking and went limp, with the kind of sleep that came with a full belly, Sandy wrapped it carefully in a clean towel and set it in a cardboard box she'd lined with more towels and placed near the fire. Copper immediately moved to lie beside the box, his body creating a barrier between it and the rest of the room. Sandy sat back, her muscles aching from tension, and looked at the dog who had fundamentally changed her quiet, isolated life in the span of 15 minutes. "You trusted me with this," she said quietly, "with something this important." Copper's tail thumped once against the floor. Not a wag exactly, an acknowledgement. Sandy stood and went to the window, looking out at the deteriorating weather. The sky had taken on that sickly green tinge that meant the worst was still coming. Trees were bending at angles that made her nervous. She could hear debris hitting the side of the cabin, branches, probably, or maybe parts of her neighbor's property 3 miles away. She should be focused on final storm preparations, should be filling the bathtub with water, moving valuables to high ground, double-checking that the generator would start if they lost power. But all she could think about was the way Copper had looked back toward the forest. The way he kept glancing at the door even now, the mud on his paws and the fresh scratches on his legs, the flooding he'd escaped from. Sandy's hand went to the window latch, and she leaned closer to the glass, trying to see through the rain to the tree line beyond. That's when she heard it. Faint, distant, almost lost in the storm. Another sound. Not the puppy sleeping in the box by the fire. Not Copper, who had lifted his head at the same moment she had, his ears pricked forward. A yelp, high-pitched and terrified, coming from the forest. Sandy's blood went cold. She turned slowly to look at Copper, and the expression on his face confirmed what she was already starting to suspect. The puppy, sleeping safely by her fire, wasn't the only one. Copper had made multiple trips. Had been going back and forth between whatever flooded den or shelter he'd found and her cabin, saving them one at a time. And he wasn't done. "How many?" Sandy whispered. Copper stood, walked to the door, and looked back at her. The message was unmistakable. More. There are more. Sandy looked at the sleeping puppy, at the storm battering her cabin, at the clock on the wall that showed she had maybe 12 hours before the hurricane made full landfall and going outside became a death sentence. Then she looked at Copper, who had trusted her with his most precious responsibility, and she realized with crystalline clarity that she had already made her choice the moment she'd opened the door 2 weeks ago and decided to leave food for a stray dog. Compassion wasn't something you could turn on and off like a switch. It was a door that, once opened, couldn't be closed again without changing who you fundamentally were. Sandy grabbed her rain jacket. "Show me," she said. Copper was out the door before she'd finished speaking, plunging back into the storm without hesitation. Sandy followed, leaving the warm cabin and the sleeping puppy behind, stepping into wind that nearly knocked her off her feet. The forest looked like something from a nightmare, dark and violent and wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. Rain came sideways, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Lightning flashed, illuminating the tree line in the stark white bursts that made everything look skeletal. Copper moved through it like he'd memorized the path, his golden form barely visible in the gloom. Sandy struggled to keep up, her boot sinking into mud that was already ankle-deep in places. They'd gone maybe 50 yards when Copper stopped abruptly and began digging. Not at the base of a tree, not in a natural shelter, at what looked like a collapsed burrow that had been washed out by flooding. Water was still pooling there, and Sandy could see why Copper had been frantic. The den was drowning. She dropped to her knees beside him and started digging with her hands, mud and water soaking through her clothes immediately. Her fingers hit something soft, and she heard a weak, muffled cry. Another puppy, smaller than the first, barely moving. Sandy pulled it free, cradling it against her chest. Its body was limp and cold, too cold. She tucked it inside her jacket, against her skin, trying to share what warmth she had. Copper was already digging again, his paws frantic. "How many?" Sandy shouted over the wind. As if in answer, another sound rose from the flooding den. Another cry. Maybe two, maybe more. Sandy's heart hammered in her chest. The storm was getting worse by the minute. The den was collapsing, and somewhere in that dark, waterlogged hole, there were more lives depending on a stray dog and a woman who had chosen isolation specifically to avoid this kind of responsibility. Copper pulled out another puppy, this one not making any sound at all. Sandy's hands shook as she took it from him, checking for breathing, for a heartbeat, for any sign of life. It was there, faint, but there. "We have to hurry," she said. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it felt like the sky was splitting apart. The forest seemed to press in around them, hostile and hungry, and Sandy realized with terrifying clarity that saving these puppies might cost her everything. But looking at Copper, mud-covered and exhausted and still digging, still fighting, she knew there was no other choice she could live with, so she kept digging. Sandy's fingers closed around another tiny body, pulling it free from the collapsing den, just as a surge of water rushed through the hollow. The puppy gasped, coughing up muddy water, its small chest heaving with the effort to breathe. 3 now. 3 puppies rescued from a death that had been minutes away. But Copper was still digging. His paws were bleeding, leaving dark smears on the mud, but he didn't stop, didn't slow. He dug with the frantic energy of someone who knew exactly what was at stake and exactly how little time remained. Sandy tucked the third puppy inside her jacket with the other 2, their combined body heat creating a small pocket of warmth against her chest. They squirmed weakly, making sounds that were more vibration than noise. "Copper," she shouted over the wind. "How many more?" He didn't answer, couldn't answer, but his behavior told her everything she needed to know. There were more, and he wouldn't leave until every single one was safe. Another crack of thunder split the sky, so close Sandy felt it in her bones. Lightning illuminated the forest in stark relief, and in that brief flash of light, she saw what she hadn't been able to see before. The den wasn't just flooding. The entire low-lying area was flooding. Water was pouring down from higher ground, channeled by the storm's intensity, turning the forest floor into a network of fast-moving streams. What had been mud minutes ago was now ankle-deep water that was rising visibly. They were running out of time. Copper's digging intensified, and then he was pulling back with something in his mouth. Another puppy. This one so covered in mud it was hard to tell what color it was supposed to be. He set it down and immediately went back to digging. Sandy grabbed the puppy, checking for life signs. It was breathing, but barely. Its body was colder than the others, and it didn't respond when she touched it. Hypothermia. This one was in serious trouble. She couldn't fit another puppy inside her jacket. There was no room. She looked around desperately and spotted a hollow at the base of a nearby tree, slightly elevated from the flooding water. She ran to it, placed the puppy carefully inside, and covered it with her jacket, leaving herself in just a t-shirt that was already soaked through. The cold hit her immediately, but she ignored it. Cold she could deal with later. Right now, she had to keep moving. When she turned back, Copper had pulled out 2 more puppies. 2 more. Sandy's mind reeled. That made 6 total. 6 puppies from a litter that had been drowning while the thought hit her with the force of the storm itself. The mother. Where was the mother? Sandy looked at Copper with new eyes, seeing details she'd missed in her panic to save the puppies. The way he moved with such precision, such knowledge of exactly where each puppy was. The way he refused to leave until all of them were accounted for. The desperate, protective energy that went beyond simple canine empathy. This wasn't a stray dog who had found abandoned puppies. This was a father protecting his children. "Oh my God," Sandy whispered. "These are yours." Copper didn't acknowledge her realization. He was already focused on the den again, digging with renewed desperation. Because if 6 puppies were out, and he was still digging, that meant another puppy emerged. 7. Sandy gathered the 2 he'd just pulled out, their tiny bodies trembling, eyes barely slits, and made another run to the hollow tree. She arranged them carefully with the 4th puppy, all of them huddled together for warmth. The wind was reaching hurricane strength now. Trees were bending at angles that made terrible creaking sounds. Rain came in sheets so thick it was like being underwater. Sandy could barely see 5 feet in front of her, but she could see Copper, still digging, still searching. And then she heard it. A sound that made her blood freeze, a high-pitched yelp of pure terror, followed by splashing. Sandy spun around and saw something that stopped her heart. One of the puppies, one she'd placed in the hollow tree, had been washed out by a surge of water. It was tumbling downstream in the current, tiny paws flailing uselessly, unable to fight against the force of the water. Sandy didn't think. She ran. The water was deeper here, past her knees, moving with shocking strength. Her boots threatened to slip on the muddy bottom with every step. But she pushed forward, eyes locked on the tiny golden form being carried away. The puppy went under. No! Sandy lunged forward, her hands plunging into the dark water, searching desperately. Her fingers closed on fur and she pulled up, gasping. The puppy hung limp in her grip, water streaming from its mouth and nose, not breathing. Sandy turned it over, supporting its tiny head, and pressed gently on its chest the way she'd seen in a video once, years ago, when her daughter had insisted they watch pet first aid tutorials. Press, release, press, release, nothing. "Come on," Sandy whispered. "Come on, baby, breathe. Press, release, press, release." The puppy convulsed, water spurting from its mouth, and then it was coughing, gasping, drawing in ragged breaths that were the most beautiful sound Sandy had ever heard. She clutched it to her chest, her own breath coming in sobs, and turned to head back to the hollow tree. That's when she saw the tree coming, not a small branch, a full tree, uprooted by the wind and the saturated ground, falling in slow motion directly toward the den where Copper was still digging. "Copper!" Sandy screamed. He looked up, saw the danger, and for one terrible moment, Sandy thought he would stay. That his need to save every last puppy would override his survival instinct. But then he was running, a golden blur in the storm, reaching her just as the tree crashed down exactly where he'd been standing seconds before. The impact sent a shock wave through the water. Debris exploded outward, and the den, the flooding, collapsing den that might have held more puppies, was completely buried under tons of wood and mud. Sandy and Copper stood in the rushing water, both of them staring at the destruction, breathing hard. Was that all of them? Sandy asked, knowing he couldn't answer but needing to ask anyway. Copper, were there any more? He turned and looked at her, and the expression in his eyes was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Grief, relief, exhaustion, and underneath it all, a question. Did we save them all? Sandy counted quickly in her mind. 3 in her jacket, 4 in the hollow tree, the one in her arms that had nearly drowned. 8 total. 8, she said. We got 8. Copper's body sagged, and Sandy realized that whether 8 was all of them or not, it was all they were going to get. The den was gone. Anything left inside was beyond saving now. Think about this. Have you ever faced a moment where you knew you'd done everything humanly possible, but you still didn't know if it was enough? That uncertainty, that desperate hope? Share your thoughts below. And if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button because we're not done yet. We have to go, Sandy said, raising her voice over the howling wind. Now! She grabbed the puppies from the hollow tree, cramming them wherever she could, pockets, inside her shirt, against her skin. Copper stayed close, his body pressed against her leg as they began the journey back to the cabin. It was only 50 yards. It might as well have been 50 miles. The water was rising so fast Sandy could see the level changing as they moved. What had been ankle-deep was now past her knees. The current pushed against her legs, trying to knock her off balance. Every step was a battle. Copper walked beside her, his body creating a barrier against the current, helping stabilize her when she stumbled. They moved together, woman and dog, fighting their way through a forest that had transformed into something actively hostile. A branch struck Sandy's shoulder, the impact spinning her sideways. She caught herself against a tree trunk, feeling the puppies squirm and protest against the pressure. One of them was crying, a thin, reedy sound that somehow cut through all the chaos. "I know," Sandy gasped. "I know. We're almost there. 30 yards, 25, 20. The cabin came into view through the sheets of rain, and Sandy had never seen anything more beautiful. Light glowed from the windows. She'd left the fire burning, left one lamp on, and it looked like salvation itself. 15 yards. 10. Sandy's boot caught on a submerged root, and she went down hard, her knees slamming into the muddy ground. The puppies inside her jacket yelped in surprise, and the one in her arms started to slip from her grasp. Copper was there immediately, his body creating a wall between her and the rushing water. Sandy used him to lever herself up, her muscles screaming in protest, everything hurting and numb at the same time. 5 yards, the porch steps. Sandy climbed them on hands and knees, too exhausted to stand, and collapsed through the door into the cabin. Copper followed, his movements just as shaky as hers, and Sandy kicked the door shut behind them. The sound of the storm immediately muffled. The howling wind became background noise instead of an all-consuming roar. And the warmth, the blessed, incredible warmth, hit Sandy like a physical force. She lay there for a moment, sprawled on her floor, covered in mud and blood and river water, 8 tiny lives squirming against her body, and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Purpose, not the hollow routine she'd been going through, not the quiet existence of someone just waiting for life to be over. Real, burning, undeniable purpose. The knowledge that she had mattered today, that her actions had meant the difference between life and death for creatures who had no other champion. It was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely exhausting. Sandy forced herself to move, pulling the puppies out carefully and checking each one. They were all alive, all breathing. Some were in better shape than others. The one that had almost drowned was still coughing weakly, but they were alive. She arranged them in the box by the fire with the first puppy she'd rescued, creating a pile of tiny, muddy, precious life. They immediately began crawling over each other, seeking warmth and comfort, their small cries filling the cabin. Only then did Sandy look at Copper. He stood in the middle of her floor, water and mud dripping from his matted coat, his legs shaking with exhaustion so profound it was a wonder he was still standing at all. Blood seeped from his paws. His eyes were half closed, but he was staring at the box of puppies with an intensity that transcended exhaustion. "Copper," Sandy said softly. "They're safe. You did it. They're all safe." For the first time since she'd met him, Copper's rigid vigilance cracked. His legs buckled, and he collapsed onto her floor with a thud that shook the floorboards. Sandy crawled to him, her own body barely functional, and checked him over. His breathing was labored but steady. His heartbeat was fast but strong. He was hypothermic, injured, and completely spent, but he was alive. "You're staying inside," Sandy told him, running her hands through his wet fur. "No arguments. You're staying right here until this storm is over. And we're going to take care of these babies together. You understand?" Copper's tail moved fractionally. Not quite a wag, but acknowledgement. Sandy looked around her cabin, at the mud tracked across her clean floors, at the box of 8 impossible puppies, at the dog who had trusted her with everything that mattered to him, at the storm still raging outside her windows. Nothing could go back to how it was. 2 weeks ago, she had been alone by choice, isolated, protected from the pain of caring too much. Now her cabin was filled with noise and mess and responsibility. 9 lives depended on her, 8 tiny ones, and 1 exhausted father who had chosen her out of all the humans in the world to help him save his children. The door she'd opened when she first left food for a stray dog had led to this moment, to this choice, to this new, terrifying, beautiful reality where she mattered again, where she was needed. Sandy stripped off her wet clothes and wrapped herself in a blanket, then set to work. Towels for the puppies, a warm bath for Copper's wounds, food, water, everything she could think of to help these lives she'd fought so hard to save. Outside, Hurricane Helena made landfall with the fury of something ancient and unstoppable. Trees fell, power lines snapped, the world became chaos. But inside Sandy's cabin, in the warm glow of firelight, a woman and a dog worked together to protect 8 tiny miracles. And for the first time in 2 years, Sandy Miller wasn't just surviving. She was living. The storm lasted 36 hours. Sandy knew because she counted every one of them, sitting in her cabin with 8 newborn puppies and 1 exhausted father who had placed his entire world in her hands. The first night was the hardest. The puppies cried constantly, thin, mewling sounds that cut through the roar of wind and rain outside. They were hungry, cold despite the fire, and searching for a mother who wasn't there and never would be. Sandy fed them every 2 hours with the eyedropper and diluted milk, knowing it wasn't adequate but having no other option. The nearest store was 15 miles away, and the roads, what she could see of them through her windows, had transformed into rivers. They were completely cut off. Copper never left the box. He lay beside it with his head resting on the edge, watching each puppy with the focused intensity of someone standing guard over something irreplaceable. When Sandy approached to feed them, he would tense slightly but never interfere. Just watched, making sure she did it right. By the second morning, the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie calm and a world transformed. Sandy ventured onto her porch and stopped, breath catching in her throat. Her yard was unrecognizable. Trees were down everywhere, their massive root systems torn from the earth and left exposed like open wounds. Water stood in pools that reflected the gray sky, and debris, branches, trash, pieces of buildings she couldn't identify, littered the ground as far as she could see. The road to town was completely underwater. Sandy stood there, looking at the flooded path that represented her only connection to the outside world, and felt the full weight of what she'd taken on settle over her shoulders. 8 puppies, too young to be away from their mother, needing round-the-clock care, proper formula, veterinary attention she couldn't provide, and a father dog who was injured, exhausted, and trusting her to keep them all alive. She went back inside and tried her phone. No signal. The landline was dead too, probably lines down somewhere between here and town. Her internet was out. She was as isolated as she'd ever been, but now that isolation felt different. Not peaceful, suffocating, because she wasn't alone anymore and the lives dependent on her couldn't wait for roads to clear and services to be restored. Sandy looked at Copper, who was staring at her with those intelligent, watchful eyes. "We're in this together now," she said quietly, "for better or worse." His tail thumped once against the floor. The next 3 days blurred together in a rhythm of feeding, cleaning, and watching. The puppies were getting stronger. She could see it in the way they moved, in the increasing volume of their cries when they were hungry. But they weren't thriving the way they should be. They needed real puppy formula. They needed warmth regulation better than what her fireplace could provide, and they needed medical evaluation to make sure the trauma of the flooding hadn't caused internal damage she couldn't see. On the 4th day after the storm, Sandy woke to the sound of an engine. She rushed to the window and saw a county emergency services truck navigating the debris-strewn road, moving slowly through the standing water. Her heart leaped. Help was here. Someone who could tell her what to do, how to properly care for these puppies, whether she'd been doing everything wrong for the past 4 days. But underneath the relief was something else, something that felt uncomfortably like dread. The truck stopped in front of her cabin and 2 people got out, a man and a woman in county emergency services uniforms. Sandy recognized the woman, Maria Chen, who ran the county animal services department. They'd met once, years ago, at a community meeting. Sandy opened the door before they could knock. "Ms. Miller?" Maria's face showed surprise and concern. "We've been doing wellness checks on isolated properties. Are you all right? Do you need evacuation?" "I'm fine," Sandy said quickly, "but I need help. I have—" She stopped, realizing how insane this was going to sound. "I have 8 newborn puppies and their father. They were caught in the flooding. I've been caring for them, but I don't know what I'm doing." Maria's expression shifted from concern to professional assessment. "May we come in?" Sandy led them inside. Copper stood immediately, positioning himself between the strangers and the box of puppies. A low growl rumbled in his chest, the first aggressive sound Sandy had ever heard from him. "It's okay," Sandy told him. "They're here to help." Copper didn't relax, but he didn't attack either, just watched with rigid suspicion. Maria knelt beside the box, her movements slow and non-threatening. She examined the puppies with practiced efficiency, handling each one gently while making soft notes on a tablet her colleague held. "You've done an incredible job," Maria said after a few minutes. "Given the circumstances. But these puppies need specialized care. Proper formula, regulated temperature, potentially medical intervention. And the father." She looked at Copper, taking in his matted coat, his healing paws, the wariness in his eyes. "He needs veterinary attention, too." Sandy's chest tightened. "What does that mean?" Maria stood, her expression sympathetic. "It means we need to transport them to the county facility. We have the resources there to properly care for newborns this young. Formula, incubators if needed, vets on call." "And then what?" Sandy asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then we assess," Maria said carefully. "The puppies will be fostered until they're old enough for adoption. The father will need to evaluate his temperament, his health, his viability for rehoming. If he's not aggressive, if he passes behavioral assessments, we'll work to find him a placement." The words landed like stones. Foster, adoption, rehoming, clinical terms for breaking apart the family that Copper had risked everything to protect. "They can't stay together?" Sandy heard herself ask. Maria's expression was kind but firm. "Miss Miller, I understand you've bonded with them, but 8 puppies and an adult dog, that's 9 animals. Finding a home that can take all of them together is virtually impossible, and keeping them here, in your situation." She glanced around the cabin. "You're isolated, no immediate vet access, limited resources. It's not sustainable." Sandy knew Maria was right, knew that everything she was saying made logical, practical sense. But looking at Copper, at the way he stood guard over his children, at the trust he'd placed in her to keep them safe, logic felt insufficient. Here's something to consider. When you make a promise, even an unspoken one, how far are you willing to go to keep it? Even when keeping it means your entire life changes? Drop your thoughts below, and if this story is pulling at your heart, share it with someone who understands that sometimes the right choice isn't the easy one. "Can I have some time?" Sandy asked. "To think about it?" Maria exchanged a glance with her colleague. "We're scheduled to return in 2 days to continue wellness checks. We can pick them up then, if that works for you. But, Miss Miller," her voice was gentle but serious, "these puppies can't wait much longer. Every day without proper care puts them at risk." "I understand," Sandy said. 2 days. After they left, Sandy stood in the middle of her cabin, looking at the box of puppies and the dog who hadn't taken his eyes off them. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the responsibility heavier. 2 days to decide if she was going to hand over the lives she'd fought through a hurricane to save. 2 days to figure out if she could live with breaking Copper's trust. 2 days to choose between the logical, practical decision and the one that felt right in a way she couldn't articulate. Sandy spent those 2 days in a fog of care and contemplation. She fed the puppies every 2 hours. She cleaned them, kept them warm, watched them grow stronger. And she watched Copper, who never strayed more than a few feet from his children. She noticed things she hadn't before, the way he would gently nudge a puppy back toward the warmth if it crawled too far. The way his body would relax fractionally when all 8 were accounted for and sleeping peacefully. The way he looked at Sandy when she fed them, not with the wariness of a stray, but with something that looked almost like partnership. On the second night, Sandy sat beside the box with a cup of coffee she was too distracted to drink. One of the puppies, the smallest one, the one that had nearly drowned, was making soft, distressed sounds. She was about to pick it up when Copper moved. He carefully lifted the puppy by the scruff of its neck, the way a mother dog would, and placed it closer to its siblings where it was warmer. The puppy immediately quieted, burrowing into the pile of warm bodies. Sandy watched this with tears burning in her eyes, because that's when she understood fully what Copper was, not just a father protecting his offspring, but a parent doing the work of 2, filling the role of mother and father both in whatever ways he could. And she was supposed to hand him over to a shelter where he'd be evaluated for viability, where bureaucrats would decide if he was adoptable enough, friendly enough, valuable enough to deserve a home, where his children would be scattered to different foster families and he'd never see them again. The decision formed in her mind like something inevitable, something that had been waiting for her to catch up to what her heart already knew. When Maria returned 2 days later, Sandy was waiting on the porch. The puppies were in a clean box beside her. Copper sat at her feet, calm but alert. Maria got out of the truck with the same colleague, carrying a transport crate. She took in the scene and her expression shifted to understanding. "You've decided," Maria said. It wasn't a question. "I'm keeping them," Sandy said. The words felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "All of them." Maria set down the crate. "Ms. Miller, that's 9 animals. Do you understand what that means? The cost, the time, the commitment? You'll need proper supplies, regular vet visits, training for the puppies as they grow. And you're isolated out here. If there's an emergency—" "I know," Sandy interrupted gently. "I know all of that. And I'm still keeping them." She looked at Copper, who was watching the exchange with his usual intense focus. "He chose me," Sandy continued. "Out of everyone he could have gone to, every house he could have approached, he chose me. He watched me for 2 weeks, assessed my character in whatever way dogs do that, and decided I was worthy of protecting what mattered most to him. And then I fought through a hurricane to help him save his children." Sandy's voice was steady despite the emotion behind it. "I don't know how to walk away from that. I don't know how to hand them over to a system that will separate them and decide their worth based on evaluations and assessments. They're a family, and somehow—" She laughed, the sound a little watery. "Somehow, they're my family too now." Maria was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "You'll need supplies. I can have formula and proper bottles sent out, and you'll need to get them to a vet within the week, all of them. I can give you a referral to someone who does house calls for situations like this." "Thank you," Sandy whispered. Maria smiled. "For what it's worth, I think you're making a crazy, impractical, completely irrational decision." She paused. "And I think it's exactly the right one." After they left, Sandy sat on her porch with Copper beside her, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The storm damage was still visible everywhere, but crews had been through to clear the main road. Life was slowly returning to normal, except nothing about Sandy's life would ever be normal again. She looked at Copper, really looked at him for the first time since this all started. At his golden coat that would be beautiful once it was clean and brushed. At his intelligent eyes that held depths she was only beginning to understand. at the gentle strength in the way he moved and protected and trusted. "You need a name," Sandy said quietly. "A real name, not just what I've been calling you in my head." Copper's ears perked up, attentive. Sandy thought about the past 2 weeks, about trust and choice, and the moment when a stray dog had placed 8 tiny lives at her feet and changed everything. "Riley," she said finally. The name felt right somehow. Strong but gentle, dignified but approachable. "Your name is Riley." Riley's tail wagged, a real wag this time, not just a single thump of acknowledgement, as if he understood that a name meant belonging, meant permanence, meant that this wasn't temporary shelter, but home. Sandy reached out and ran her hand through his matted fur. "We're going to figure this out together," she told him. "You and me and 8 puppies who are going to turn this quiet little cabin into absolute chaos." Riley leaned into her touch, and for the first time since she'd met him, he made a sound that wasn't a bark or a whimper. He sighed, deep and long and content. The sound of someone finally safe. Inside the cabin, the puppies were crying for their evening feeding. Sandy stood, Riley immediately at her side, and together they went inside to care for the family they'd fought so hard to save. The door she'd opened 2 weeks ago when she'd decided to leave food for a stray dog had led her here. To this choice, this commitment, this new life that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. And as Sandy Miller prepared bottles of formula, while 8 tiny puppies cried and 1 devoted father stood guard, she realized something that made her smile despite the exhaustion, despite the uncertainty, despite everything. She wasn't alone anymore, and she never would be again. 6 weeks after the hurricane, Sandy stood in her cabin watching 8 puppies tumble over each other in a chaotic pile of golden fur and needle-sharp teeth. They had grown impossibly fast. What had been barely their heartbeats and closed eyes were now rambunctious balls of energy that treated her cabin like their personal playground. They chewed her furniture, knocked over her coffee, and filled every quiet corner with the kind of noise that made silence feel like a distant memory. Sandy had never been happier. The veterinarian, Dr. Patricia Torres, who made house calls to isolated properties, had declared all 8 puppies healthy and thriving despite their traumatic start. Riley had been treated for his injuries, given a full examination, and declared, "One of the most devoted fathers I've ever seen in 30 years of practice." But the reality that Sandy had been avoiding for 6 weeks could no longer be ignored. 8 puppies couldn't stay in a 1-bedroom cabin. Not long term. Not as they grew from adorable chaos into full-sized dogs who would need space, training, and individual attention she couldn't provide alone. Maria had been right from the beginning. Some of them would need to find other homes. The decision to let them go was the hardest thing Sandy had done since deciding to keep them in the first place, because it felt like betrayal, like she'd made a promise to Riley that she was now breaking, that she'd fought through a hurricane to save his children only to give them away. But keeping them all would have been selfish. Would have been putting her own attachment ahead of what the puppies actually needed to thrive. So Sandy worked with Maria to carefully screen potential adopters, not just anyone who wanted a cute puppy, people who understood the responsibility, who had space and time and genuine commitment, people who would love these puppies the way Riley had protected them. The first adoption happened on a Tuesday morning in early October. A young family arrived, parents in their 30s with 2 children, a boy and a girl, both under 10. They had a large fenced yard, another dog at home who was gentle and well-trained, and references from their veterinarian that spoke to years of responsible pet ownership. Sandy brought out the puppies and watched them interact. The smallest one, the one that had nearly drowned, the one Copper had moved closer to its siblings that night, immediately attached itself to the little girl, followed her everywhere, climbed into her lap, licked her face with puppy enthusiasm that made the girl dissolve into giggles. The match was perfect. But when the family was ready to leave, Puppy secured in a carrier with supplies and paperwork completed, Sandy felt her throat close up. She knelt down and held the puppy one more time, feeling its tiny heart beating against her palm. "You're going to have a good life," she whispered. "Be happy." Riley stood beside her, watching the carrier being loaded into the family's car. His body was tense, and Sandy put her hand on his head, uncertain what he was feeling. Did he understand? Did he know this wasn't abandonment but love taking a different form? The car pulled away, and Riley watched it disappear down the road. Then he turned and walked back into the cabin, going directly to the box where the remaining 7 puppies were sleeping. He lay down beside them. His body curved protectively around them and didn't leave that spot for the rest of the day. Over the next 3 weeks, 5 more puppies found homes, a retired couple who had lost their dog to old age and wanted to honor its memory by raising another, a woman who trained service dogs and saw potential in one of the more attentive puppies, a man who lived on a farm and needed a dog who could work and play in equal measure. Each adoption was carefully considered, thoroughly vetted, and absolutely heartbreaking. Sandy cried after each one, but she also felt something else beneath the grief: pride. Because these puppies that had been hours from drowning were now going to families who would treasure them, who would give them the individual attention and training they needed to become the best versions of themselves. Riley's behavior shifted with each departure. He became quieter, more watchful, but he never showed aggression or distress, just a kind of resigned acceptance that made Sandy wonder how much dogs truly understood about the complexity of love and loss. By the end of October, only 2 puppies remained, the 2 that no one had chosen yet, not because they were defective or problematic, but because Sandy had made a decision she couldn't fully articulate even to herself. These 2 were staying. One was the puppy that had stopped breathing in the flood. The one Sandy had performed chest compressions on while standing in rushing water. She'd named him Storm, and he'd grown into a confident, curious dog who followed her everywhere with absolute devotion. The other was the puppy Riley had pulled from the den last, the one who had been deepest, most at risk, most unlikely to survive. Sandy had named her River, and she was quieter than her siblings, more contemplative, with Riley's same watchful intelligence in her eyes. 3 dogs, Riley and his 2 remaining children. It wasn't the whole family, but it was their family, and somehow it felt right. One morning in early November, Sandy carried her coffee onto the porch the way she had before any of this began. The air was crisp with the promise of fall, and the storm damage had been mostly cleared. New trees had been planted to replace the ones lost. Life had found its rhythm again. Riley was already there, sitting in the exact spot where she'd first seen him 2 months ago, but everything about him was different now. His coat was clean and brushed, golden and shining in the morning light. His body was healthy, well-fed, strong, and his eyes, those intelligent, watchful eyes, held contentment instead of desperation. Storm and River tumbled out after Sandy, immediately chasing each other across the porch with the boundless energy of young dogs who felt completely safe. Sandy sat in her rocking chair, the only furniture she'd insisted on keeping from her marriage, and watched her family play. This wasn't what she'd planned when she'd moved to this isolated cabin 2 years ago. She'd wanted quiet, solitude, protection from the pain of caring too much, Instead, she'd gotten chaos and responsibility, and a love so fierce it had pulled her back into life, whether she was ready or not. Riley turned to look at her, and their eyes met. In that moment, Sandy understood something she'd been circling around for weeks. The trust he'd placed in her that day, when he'd brought his puppy to her porch, wasn't about ownership. It was about recognizing someone capable of carrying weight when he could no longer carry it alone. It was about seeing past isolation to the person she'd been before grief had made her withdraw. He hadn't needed her to save his children. He'd needed her to remember how to be human again, to remember that connection and responsibility and caring weren't weaknesses to be avoided, but the very things that made life worth living. And entrusting her with his most precious responsibility, he'd given her back herself. "Thank you," Sandy whispered. Riley's tail wagged once. Understanding, acknowledgement, partnership. The weeks turned into months, and life in the cabin settled into a new normal. Sandy worked with the 6 adopted puppies' families to arrange regular meetups, park gatherings where the siblings could see each other and Riley could verify his children were thriving. The families embraced these reunions with surprising enthusiasm, creating a kind of extended network that felt more like community than obligation. Riley would greet each of his children with careful attention, sniffing them thoroughly, assessing their health and happiness with the same protective focus he'd shown in the flooded den. And each time, he'd return to Sandy's side with visible relief. They were okay. They were loved. His work was done. Storm and River grew into beautiful dogs, strong, intelligent, devoted. They helped Sandy in ways she hadn't expected, pulling her further into the world instead of letting her retreat. They needed walks, which meant she encountered neighbors. They needed training, which meant she attended classes in town. They needed play, which meant she laughed more than she had in years. The isolation she'd chosen after her divorce transformed into connection. Not overwhelming or suffocating, but gentle and earned. The kind of community built on shared experience and genuine care rather than obligation or history. Before we reach the end of this incredible journey, think about this. Have you ever had an experience that completely changed the direction of your life? That pulled you out of isolation into connection you didn't know you needed? Share your story in the comments, and if this story has touched your heart, make sure you're subscribed because stories like this remind us what really matters. December brought the first cold snap, and with it, another storm warning. Nothing like Hurricane Helena, but enough to require preparation. Sandy secured the shutters, brought in outdoor furniture, and filled containers with fresh water, routine now instead of panic. That evening, she stood on her porch as the first drops of rain began to fall. Riley stood beside her, Storm and River at her feet, all of them watching the darkening sky together. On impulse, Sandy went inside and filled a bowl with kibble. She carried it outside and placed it at the edge of her property, where the yard met forest, the same spot where she'd first left food for a nameless stray dog who would change her life. She didn't know if any animal needed it, didn't know if anyone was watching from the tree line the way Riley had watched all those weeks ago, assessing, deciding, choosing, but if someone was out there, something scared, hungry, desperate, searching for a sign that the world contained kindness, she wanted them to find it. Riley watched her set down the bowl, then looked at her with something that might have been approval. "Just in case," Sandy told him. They went back inside as the rain intensified, and Sandy built a fire while the dogs settled into their usual spots, Riley by the hearth, Storm and River in a tangled pile on the rug. The cabin was warm and full of breathing and alive in ways it never had been during her 2 years of self-imposed isolation. Sandy made tea and sat in her chair, listening to the storm and feeling grateful for the chaos, for the responsibility, for the trust a desperate father had placed in her that had somehow become her salvation. She must have dozed off, because when she woke, it was fully dark and the fire had burned down to embers. The dogs were all asleep, and the cabin was quiet except for the sound of rain and wind outside. Sandy was about to get up to add wood to the fire when Riley's head suddenly lifted. His ears pricked forward, and his body went rigid with attention. Not aggression, but focused awareness. The same posture he'd had that first day when he'd watched her from the tree line. Storm and River woke immediately, alert to their father's change in demeanor. Sandy felt her heart kick. "What is it?" Riley stood and walked to the door, his movements deliberate. He looked back at her, then at the door, then at her again. The message was clear. Something was out there. Sandy grabbed a flashlight and opened the door carefully. Rain immediately blew in, but she stepped onto the porch anyway, Riley at her side, and shined the light toward the tree line. The bowl she'd left was empty, and there, barely visible in the beam of her flashlight, were tracks in the mud. Not dog tracks, something different. Smaller paw prints leading toward the forest, then away, then back again, as if whatever had eaten the food had made multiple trips, as if there was more than one, as if something out there was desperately trying to save. Sandy's breath caught. The pattern was familiar. The behavior was familiar. An animal in crisis, making multiple trips to save something it couldn't carry all at once. She looked at Riley, who was staring at the tracks with the same focused intensity. He'd seen this pattern before, too. Recognized it. Understood it in the way only someone who'd lived through it could understand. "There's more out there," Sandy whispered. "Something else that needs help." Riley looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the question. "What are you going to do?" Sandy looked at the muddy tracks, at the empty bowl, at the storm that was just beginning, at the cabin full of warmth and safety behind her. 2 months ago, she would have closed the door, would have told herself it wasn't her problem, would have protected herself from the pain of caring, but that woman was gone. Changed by a stray dog who'd trusted her with everything and shown her that isolation wasn't protection. It was just another kind of dying. Sandy Miller looked at Riley and smiled, the kind of smile that came with certainty and purpose and the bone-deep knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "We're going to do what we do," she said simply. "We're going to help." She grabbed her rain jacket and a carrier from the closet. Riley was already at the door, waiting, ready. Storm and River stood behind him, too young for this kind of rescue but alert and eager to learn. Sandy opened the door wider and the storm rushed in, but this time she wasn't afraid, because she'd learned something crucial in the past 2 months, something about trust and choice and the way love asks us to show up even when it's hard, even when it's terrifying, even when we don't know if we're strong enough. We show up anyway, and whatever was out there in the storm, whatever desperate soul had found her bowl of food and was making multiple trips to save something precious, they would find help when they needed it most, just like Riley had, just like she had. The door she'd opened 2 months ago when she decided to feed a stray dog had led to this moment, to this choice, to this truth she couldn't unknow. Compassion wasn't a single act. It was a way of living, a door that stayed open, a light left on in the darkness for whoever might need it. Sandy stepped into the storm with Riley beside her, following the muddy tracks into the forest, and felt more alive than she had in years. Behind them, Storm and River watched from the porch, learning by example what it meant to be part of this family. And somewhere ahead in the darkness, something desperate and scared and fighting to protect what mattered most was about to discover they weren't alone after all. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning again.